Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. I apologize for the delay. We were trying to figure out the technicalities of Google Hangouts. But we are here now. One panelist will be joining us shortly. But in the meantime, I wanted to get started and introduce the speakers we do have with us right now. So we're very lucky today to have with us Maryam Abu Ali, who is the director of the Prisoner and Families Committee of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Next, we have MGO Whitlock, who is the chair of the Peace and Justice Committee and Maryland State Chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, and Patrick Hall, who is the chair of the Trenton chapter of the Campaign to End the New Jim Crow. And my name is Maha Hilal, and I am the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. We are an organization that works to combat human and civil rights abuses that have occurred post 9/11 and which have primarily targeted the Muslim and Muslim American community. We do a number of things, including raising awareness of the policies that have developed post 9/11 and supporting families who've been directly targeted by the war on terror. So I want to get started with a couple of questions. The first question is for the panelists. Can you describe to me or tell me what got you involved in the issue of solitary confinement? So I know some of you have a more personal connection to the issue, and some have a closer to with advocacy. So can you talk, I guess, starting with Maryam, followed by MGL, and then Patrick, about what got you involved? So Maryam, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Um, my experience with or what got me involved with solitary confinement is it's a bit personal. My brother was detained overseas in Saudi Arabia in 2003. He was detained without charges for 2 years, and in 2005, he was charged with conspiracy and terrorism-related charges. Um, the only evidence admitted in court was a confession that was obtained under torture in Saudi Arabia. Uh, he was so as soon as he landed in the U.S., he was held in solitary confinement. So before he was convicted or found guilty, he was detained or he was being held in solitary confinement. So he was actually convicted and sentenced initially to 30 years and later life, and he's serving that time in of the AD Max in Florence, Colorado, which is a high security prison, and yeah, he's pretty much spent the last 13 years in solitary confinement.
Thank you for sharing, Maryam. And I want to make sure people knew about your brother's case and his name. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about how you find out more about his case.
Sure. So my brother's name is Ahmed Abu Ali. He was born in Houston, Texas in 1981. He was raised in Falls Church, Virginia. He graduated valedictorian of his high school class. He enrolled in the University of Maryland, and then a year later he got a scholarship offer. He'd always been interested in Islamic studies, and he got a scholarship offer to pursue that field in Medina. A student at the University of Medina, and in 2003, that's when the war on terror was before, and they started raiding homes in the community and detaining young men. And a prominent case is actually the case in Virginia. So he was initially detained in relation to the Kimball case, but is overseas. So the FBI for him.
Mariam, can you hold on for 1 second?
Sorry.
Can you just hold on for 1 second?
Sure.
So for Patrick and MGL, and myself, if we're not speaking, can you hit mute because the sound is very sensitive and it will switch the screen if it hears more sound, so we can hear each other better. If you just hit mute when you're not speaking.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I was saying, he was detained in Saudi Arabia in 2003. He was held without charges. At the same time, the FBI had raided our home in Virginia, and that's how we came to find out about his detention. We did not hear from him at all for over a month, and we started, uh, contacting everyone they knew, everyone in the government, senators, politicians, governors, uh, some answers on why Ahmed was detained. And we actually received multiple statements from the FBI, including public statements that were made saying that um, we're not interested in Mr. Ali. In found and actually in the Washington Post. Um, and they kept saying that it was purely a Saudi case. Eventually, my parents were able to collect enough evidence. They pretty much recorded his phone calls. They recorded phone calls. They kept emails, and they had some human rights attorneys take it to court. So they filed a habeas corpus petition. The judge found out that in December 2014, he actually ordered a discovery, and he stated that there was sufficient information that Ahmed had been tortured. Unfortunately, we that was actually a big victory for us, and we thought, this nightmare was going to come to an end. But unfortunately, the government found themselves um, in a tough situation. They didn't know what to do with him since he'd been tortured overseas. He'd been detained for 2 years without charges. So the easiest thing they could do was to bring him back and charge him with terrorism-related charges. So he was charged, and unfortunately, obviously, due to the political climate, he was convicted. The judge had said at his sentencing that that 30 years was being lenient due to the fact that, keep in mind that his so-called so again, he was only accused of conspiracy, and the evidence for that was a confession obtained under torture. The government we appealed, and the government cross appealed. So they actually wanted to increase his sentence, and they did. So he was resentenced to life. And as I mentioned, he's been in solitary confinement both in Saudi Arabia and in the US. It was only a short time in Saudi Arabia that he spent out of solitary confinement, but since he landed in the US, he's been in solitary confinement.
Thank you for sharing, Mariam. So, Jill, could you talk a little bit about what got you involved with this issue?
Thank you for sharing your story, Miriam. Um, my name is Jill Whitlock. I actually got started with working with political prisoners in middle school. I became interested in the case of Nelson Mandela, as well as the first Intifada in occupied Palestine. Since that time, as you can say, 27 years, I've spent working to free political prisoners in the United States and across the world.
Great. And then Patrick?
So he's got to take himself off mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yes, yeah, I actually have a different kind of a story. I've always volunteered and give my time and my efforts to helping people in my community. Uh, from the time I was 16 years old and got involved in the Guardian Angels and uh, and just anything that has something to do with humanity, I was involved in. But it was only just recently, over the last 3 years, that that I read a book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And even before that, my son, who was a straight A student all through school, went off on a scholarship to College of Virginia, and after 1 year, returned back home, and for whatever reason, we find out that he was a part of a gang. He was part of the Crips, which was surprising for his mom and I because we thought we knew every move he made and everything that happened. So he didn't act like a gang member. But lo and behold, he was a part of some made-up gang. And one day, three of the members went out and did three armed robberies and actually shot one of the victims. They called a few people to come pick them up after they had robbed a few, these three individuals. My son was the last one they called. He was available just coming from a friend's house or a party. He goes and picks them up. He goes to the gas station right afterwards. The police surround him, and he winds up in jail. Spent 18 months in jail and was in solitary confinement. And he, of course, was not a part of the crimes at all. So, just to make a long story short, that was my first taste of solitary confinement. Before that, I had heard about it, but never had any experiences from any of my family members. And then the more I studied and the more I got involved in the campaign to end the new Jim Crow, the more I come to realize the horror as well as the torture that goes on inside of these places. So that was my introduction to solitary confinement.
So, for those viewers who may not know a lot about this issue, I'm wondering if you guys could talk about, and I think there's a bit of an echo, so if you can, again, mute your microphones. If you could talk a little bit about the conditions in which people are held when they're put in solitary confinement, and maybe a little bit about the ways in which solitary confinement is used as a punitive measure, but is often sort of an excuse to punish prisoners that perhaps the guards don't like. So if you could comment on that in any order. We cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the conditions vary from state to state and also from prison to prison, and the conditions in which an individual winds up in solitary confinement also varies. For years, I always thought that only the hardened criminals, the mass rapists or uh, serial killers wind up in solitary confinement, but this is not true. A person can be thrown into what they call the hole or the shoe or solitary confinement for not making up their bed properly from the population tier, or maybe something happened where the guard doesn't like the individual, or anything can happen that can get a person put into solitary confinement, and that's what's been happening in the United States. And more of it has been happening to African Americans and other, ethnics other than whites. More and more that's been happening to other race. And so those are the things that can get you inside solitary confinement. And while you're in solitary confinement, we've got members of our organization who have been in solitary confinement for many, many years. And although on paper it may say you're in for 23 hours of the day and then you're let out for 1 hour. Well, we've got members who have been in solitary confinement for 3 or 4 or 5 days before they're let out for their hour out of solitary confinement. We've had situations where the toilet overflows and it has not been repaired for months. And so the person inside solitary confinement has to withstand all of this for long periods of time. And of course, if you are in a state of solitary for more than 140 to 145 days, the brain starts to become unbalanced, and that's why we have such a high rate of mental cases of these guys and girls coming out of solitary confinement, such as the young man who was only 15, 16 years old that was supposedly has stolen a book bag, and he was put into solitary confinement, and all kinds of other things happened to him that happens in prison. And as a result of that, by the time he got out, almost 2 years later, he wound up committing suicide because of the mental situations he's had to endure. So there's lots of things inside of solitary confinement that happens, but I'll let some of my other colleagues speak on that as well.
And then, Jill, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I just wanted to echo some of the things that Patrick said. We know here in the state of Maryland, the Vera Institute actually came to do a study of solitary confinement. Well, of course, we're told by the Maryland Department of Corrections that they don't do solitary confinement anymore, which we know is a lie. And I'm sure you know exactly, what I mean, Patrick. I see you shaking your head. So we actually had legislation in the state of Maryland last year requesting various information and reports from the Department of Corrections and how they use what they call administrative segregation, private segregation, or what they consider to be a way to keep a specific individual inmate to themselves, and or disciplinary segregation. Those are the three things that that we have identified here in the state of Maryland. So that's disciplinary segregation. That's also the private, as well as what was the third? I'm sorry, it was the third one that I had mentioned. But what we found is very similar to some of the things that Patrick said. Inmates could be thrown in solitary confinement simply for not moving fast enough when the guard told them to move, refusing to work a job that they were given. We found that several inmates were actually in solitary confinement for using foul language. One of the major things what the research told us was that gang affiliation was a major inkling of those that we have in solitary confinement here in the state of Maryland. We also looked at issues of race. We also looked at issues of mental health. And as a social worker, when it comes to solitary confinement, many of the groups that I work with, we actually find this against our ethical principles to be engaged in such practices inside of the prisons, where many of us work as mental health professionals on those wings, in those units. It is an ethical violation of our principles.
Thank you. Mariam, can you tell us a little bit about the conditions under which Ahmed is being held? Anything regarding like the cell size or anything like that, if he's allowed to have any recreational time, that kind of thing.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ADX Supermax in Florence, Colorado, and that's where um, uh, like a lot of young Muslim men who were convicted of terrorism post 9/11 are being held. Um, and I don't know what you guys know about the ADX Supermax, but pretty much even former wardens had called it the cleaner version of hell. And the media has not been allowed in since 2002. I think they were allowed in once in 2007, but for like very limited preview of the prison. So no inmates have ever been interviewed post 2002. So what I can tell you about it is it's actually they're in constant solitary confinement. So despite the fact that they have the 1 hour of recreation, that hour is also spent alone. So they're in 23-hour lockdown and then they get 1 hour of recreation, but for that 1 hour, they actually have to get strip searched. So many even forego that hour to engage in exercise or to leave their cell. In terms of their cell, they spend their days in 12 by 7 foot cells with thick concrete walls and double sets of sliding metal doors. They have a single window about 3 feet high by only 4 inches wide. Um, each cell has a sink toilet combo and an automated shower. And they sleep on concrete slabs topped with thin mattresses. So while some of them have TVs and many of them do have access to books and newspapers, they obviously are limited. So for example, my brother is only allowed to receive 8 books a month. And for a very long time, he wasn't allowed to watch television. He also wouldn't receive the newspaper on time for a very long period of time. Also, the policy in ADMAX or ADX Florence is that for the first 3 years, prisoners are not allowed to come into contact with other prisoners at any time, anywhere on the premises. So after that, like good behavior can earn them outside time, and they're allowed limited time with other inmates. Uh, I think it's several times a week. It really depends on the unit and the rules. I don't like. I guess it's not really something that many people know. It's just sort of what we know from our family members. Um, and I mean, obviously, I can tell you for a fact that solitary confinement is a form of torture. It's psychological torture, and if you didn't go in with mental health issues, you're definitely going to come out with mental health issues and serious mental health issues. There are many stories of inmates hearing others screaming or yelling or banging, and they obviously um, they go years without any human interaction, any like no like even the prison guards don't interact with the inmates, so they receive everything through a slot in the door, um, and they can go days without speaking to a human being. So it's criminal, really.
So, Patrick, I want to ask you a question based on what Miriam just spoke about. So, the mock solitary confinement cell that we saw at the conference on mass incarceration, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to create that and how you tried to sort of emulate the actual conditions that prisoners live in?
Here I am. Well, for 3 years, we've gone around doing presentations and documentaries and forums and panels such as we have here. And I remember we were preparing for a rally at the State House in Trenton, New Jersey. And I said to my to my colleagues there, I says, we really need something that people can actually feel and touch and see, because saying it is one thing, but actually experiencing it is something else. And so I created a concept of building a replica of a solitary confinement cell, and we were going to display it at the State House, but of course the state officials would not allow us to actually display it. And so a year later, we decided we're going to build it anyway, and we're going to take it around to different events so that people can get a chance to touch and feel and get and come inside and see exactly what some of their loved ones or things that they've heard of and people they've heard of, what they're actually, at least part of what they're experiencing, from the size of the cells to everything. And so we built our replica off of a 6x8 size solitary confinement cell. Now, there are many different sizes depending on where you are, what state, and what prison. There are some, and ours is a single inmate solitary confinement cell. There are some that are smaller than ours that are 5x7 and have 2 inmates in them. So they vary widely. And in ours, there are no windows. There are the light stays on 24 hours a day. There is no reading material at all. There's no television or radio. None of that is allowed. Another big part of it is there's no climate control. So when it's hot outside, it's hot inside. When it's cold, it's very cold. And so there's a guy by the name of Olgery, who's also a part of us and the tours that we give with the solitary confinement cell. He spent 22 years inside of a solitary confinement cell, and he was in Trenton State Prison most of his time, but he's been all over the place. And he's had 2 close friends of his who have died from the heat inside the solitary confinement cell, and he's had a number of friends who have committed suicide as well. And so that's the reason why we did it. So it is completely cinder block all the way around, concrete floors. The one that we replicate actually is a steel bed, and the combination of the sink and toilet is also steel. And that's the one that we replicate, and that's the one that we show and take around to different places. And we've been local for this summer because we just built it this summer in May. And next year, we've got requests to go as far as Hawaii. I wish it was Hawaii. As far as Ohio, Boston, down in Delaware, New York. So we'll be all over the place next season. And that's our cell.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. I believe you're planning to come perhaps to the DC area next year, hopefully.
I'm sorry?
I believe you're going to come to the DC area next year. We're going to arrange for
DC and Delaware.
DC area.
Oh, DC area. I'm looking forward to coming down to DC area.
Okay, great. So, Amajio, I wanted to pick up on what you talked about in terms of your profession as a social worker and the ethical contract that comes with that. So we know with the torture project in the U.S. is a war on terror. A lot of it has actually involved psychologists and others working in a mental health capacity. Has there been any sort of movement from within these healthcare professionals, and specifically mental health care professionals, to address the use of solitary confinement as torture?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was on mute there for a second. There's actually a really big struggle with this between the social work camps and psychologists. However, the groups that I work with, we agree with the United Nations standards set by Juan Menendez, saying that anything beyond 15 days is considered torture. Um, so we go by that standard. Myself specifically, I would say less days than 15. But I think that the fact that Juan has set that standard, not just, yeah, I mean, it's an international standard that we can all look from. Social work and mental health in and of itself. We've been involved in the prison industrial complex since the very beginning of our profession. Some social workers do understand that there needs to be, a separation of space and time, for some inmates based on whatever specific situation might have occurred inside of the prison system. That some may go on administrative segs, some may be disciplinary, or some may be personal. However, we know that some people could spend decades, and entire lifetimes, in solitary confinement. And as Miriam had stated, it's just criminal. And one of those cases I just wanted to bring to light was political prisoner Albert Woodfox, who's now going to be tried again for a third time. This is an elderly man who's been incarcerated for decades, been in solitary confinement for more than 40 years. He suffers from multiple, healthcare problems. And this man every day, has to be, searched and probed and prodded if he goes out of his cell. This is an elderly man that, if anybody knows what body cavity search is, this man is being abused and tortured, every day by these correctional officers in Louisiana. And it's not just Albert Woodfox. Um, we have Russell Maroon Schultz, political prisoner in Pennsylvania, who family and friends and activists and organizers fought for years to try to get him out of solitary confinement. He's finally out of solitary confinement and can hug his children and his grandchildren, and have that family contact. We also have, and I would be very mistaken if I didn't bring up the case of Hugo Yugi Purnell, who was recently murdered on the yard in New Folsom Prison in California. But he worked very hard as an elder to create the end of hostilities between the different gangs and organizations inside of the prison. And he himself was in the shoe, and fighting with the prisoners in California. So I just wanted to bring up those three cases regarding issues of political prisoners.
Great. So I want to come back to that issue in terms of cases that have been really prominent and those which may have shaped any sort of legislation around solitary confinement. But before that, I'm wondering if you all could speak about if you, in the case of Miriam, speaking with your brother over the last decade plus, have you observed any significant and substantial changes in, his, I guess, behavior or how he communicates with you, that kind of thing? And for Emma Jill and Patrick, have you worked with anyone who you've sort of been able to, again, witness or be able to see these changes in behavior that are, in terms of mental health consequences of solitary confinement, and just really see how their situation or, their behavioral health has changed over the time that they've been in solitary confinement?
Yeah. Um, so unfortunately, one of the things that prevents us from effectively talking about Ahmed's case and advocating on his behalf is that we, as a family, and Ahmed himself is under something called special administrative measures. And what that is, it's essentially a gag order where I cannot discuss with anyone, um, uh, not even his attorney, anything relating to our conversations, contents of his letters, our visits, phone calls. So I cannot tell you how he's doing. I can't tell you what he's complaining about. I can't tell you, I can't show you the content of his letters. And it's really been, and it's been devastating, because, you know, anytime we want to talk to the media, we're just so limited in what we can say about his case and what he's going through personally. And so, unfortunately, I can't share what his mental health status is, but obviously, I mean, anyone who spends a significant time in solitary confinement without any human contact, with limited um, contact with family, and one thing about SAMS is it only allows him to speak to immediate family. So it actually took us more than 12 years to get my grandmother approved to finally speak with him. In that time period, several uncles passed away, grandparents passed away, and he was never able to talk to them. He was never able to send them letters. They weren't able to send him letters. So it's really inhumane, and it is meant to break us down, to humiliate us, and it's just absolutely just outrageous and inhumane. Um, but yeah.
So thank you, Mariam. Abigil or Patrick, do you want to comment on this?
Hello?
Hello?
Okay. Definitely, we've noticed that um, there's a high recidivism rate
Mm-hmm.
regarding prisoners who have experienced solitary confinement, who are then released out into the street. That is a really big problem. Two other issues associated to mental health have to do with our gay, lesbian, and transgender brothers and sisters who have experienced um, horror of being in solitary confinement. Um, there's definitely major issues with youth, and now we know that there's a strong push to end solitary confinement for youth under the age of I guess 18 or 21, depending on whatever the stipulations are around the country with the specific states. So I think New York is actually taking the lead on that.
Okay, great. Patrick, did you have anything to add?
There we go. Yeah, I don't. Other than my son, I don't know anyone personally that I knew them before solitary confinement and then afterwards. But I noticed that in my son, he has an issue with focusing. He has an issue with controlling his emotions. He can be nice and calm one day, and the next thing he's angry or he's upset or he thinks that the world owes him something. So he has all of those issues which interfere with him being able to hold down a job or even be a good parent. And so he's struggling with a lot of things, and he was only in solitary confinement for a short period of time. You have members of our organization who you see the same sort of traits. It's almost like you can have a conversation with the person, and the next thing you know, they're off in another land in another world, and you're talking, and the conversation is actually over, but you don't know it. They're off into their own little world and relaxing, and sometimes you'll see them in a room and they're over to themselves because they have problems with with large groups of people, being in a room with large groups of people. So these are the effects that are happening in these guys and girls that are coming out of solitary confinement, and then the extra torture that's put on them from security guards and other things that even perpetuates them being in solitary. So it's a terrible situation. But those are the things that we've seen from the folks that we know who's been in solitary confinement for long periods of time.
Okay, great. So one of the issues that we haven't talked about that some of you have alluded to is the fact that solitary confinement is in essence torture. We know in the post 9/11 era, the definition of torture has been narrowed, and under the Bush administration, it was so narrow that it was defined as anything only resulting in organ failure or death. So this country has a very tenuous and terrible legacy when it comes to torture. Why is it that, despite all that we know about solitary confinement, including what the impacts are on the prisoner directly and the long-term effects of solitary confinement, most importantly their mental health condition, why is it that this issue is not treated seriously as one of torture?
Well, I can tell you some of the reasons that we find it is. And just to sort of lay another foundation of what you just mentioned, Eastern State Prison in the early 1800s created a prison solely of solitary confinement cells. And they quickly found out within the first 3 years that it was not the right thing to do. The Quakers actually did it. And after studying these prisoners that were going, literally, mentally disturbed, they closed down the prison and says this doesn't work. So we knew since the early 1800s that this does not work and it's torture. So the only thing we can come up with is that in order for us to bring this back, it has to be for the reason of torturing people. Has to be. There's no other reason for it. And so why are we torturing individuals? Well, let's take a look at who we're actually torturing. We're torturing people who cannot afford to get out because they can't afford attorneys. We're torturing people who are of black, brown skin. Those are the people who we're torturing. If you look at all of the people who are involved, the whole 80,000 individuals that are currently in solitary confinement, most of them are people of black and brown color skin. And so it has to be a racism background or backset for this particular treatment. It has to be. There's no other way of looking at it. And so that's the way we see it.
Miriam, do you want to ask?
Um, Absolutely agree. I mean, there was no reason for Ahmed to be held in solitary confinement from the beginning, before he was even convicted or found guilty. He never posed a security threat. He was never accused of hurting anyone. So, when we look at the way young Muslim men have been treated post 9/11 in our country, in the prison system, the conditions of confinement, the different cases of both, false allegations, entrapment, all of that. It all points to, it's all targeted. It's all done intentionally. The conditions of confinement are intentional. I did want to point out actually that one thing I can say publicly is that Ahmed went on a hunger strike in 2009, him along with his entire unit, because the conditions of confinement were unbearable, like simply unbearable. People, these incarcerated men would they have no means to protest their conditions, and they have no way to voice what they're going through to the outside world. And so what they did was they went on a hunger strike, a collective hunger strike, demanding some, basic changes. And he was on a hunger strike for 2 months, and he lost 50 pounds, and he was actually he had to be force fed. Um, and only then did they get any response from the people who run the prison, or whoever was in charge at the time. I'm sorry, I'm blanking, but yeah, pretty much that's not. I mean, there have been multiple collective hunger strikes across multiple prisons in the U.S. And I mean, I don't have too much knowledge on that, but I don't know if one of you does, but I know that, obviously hunger strikes are one way for prisoners to get some attention to their conditions.
Jill, do you want to comment?
Yes, I agree with Patrick. Racism, Islamophobia, as well as just political dissent in general have, are definitely considered a threat. Prisoners who are um, self-aware or self-educated or self-knowledgeable, who make an effort to educate other prisoners, about history, what's happening on the outsider, or galvanizing, around, a hunger strike. They also wind up in solitary confinement. The guards pick and choose, who they want to go after. You know, this is the, I guess, the second thing beyond the death penalty, which of course, the guards can't give somebody the death penalty. Only the judge and the system can do that. But solitary confinement is a way for the correctional officers and the system within, to punish our friends, our family, and this is what they do. They try to, make an example, out of, our people, and as expressed, it's just it's torture, it's torturous conditions, and we just have to, keep on fighting as much as we can as a collective to keep exposing everything that is happening. I know I've worked with the the families of the Dallas Six in Pennsylvania, and they actually their way of protesting was actually covering their whatever is considered a window or that space where food is slid in the door. They actually covered windows, in response to seeing another inmate being tortured. And therefore, they were actually tortured and beaten and are all facing various charges now at this point. So,
So can you, if you guys know the answer to this question, what is generally the American public's reaction to or support of solitary confinement? And to what extent does that help or not help in, getting legislation passed to sort of end this type of torture?
I will say over here on my end, I think the average American person is completely ignorant. When people think of like, somebody being thrown in a hole, their first thought of like, the military putting somebody in the ground somewhere or doing, something associated to like zero dark 30. So I think the American public has, these very, I guess, odd thoughts of what they consider, solitary confinement to be. And like I said earlier, even our Maryland Department of Corrections absolutely denies that they're engaged in any type of solitary confinement. and claimed that they stopped those practices, in the 80s. So, it's ignorance of the American public, and then it's absolute denial within these correctional systems. But I mean, they know what they're doing, but of course, they're going to have to spread that ignorance and denial to the American public.
One of the things that we found is um, most of the people who are being affected the most, and in your sayings on your flyer says it best: out of sight, out of mind. Uh, that's why they don't let the media in. That's why it's not talked about because of that reason. And so we found that the people who are being affected the most knows the least amount about what's happening, other than those who have family members or people that they know. And when it comes to different race, even in all of the events that we've put on and things that we've been doing, the audience have been 80 to 90% white, upper middle class, and upper class whites who had no clue what was going on and what's happening. They only know what they read in the newspapers, and the newspaper is only going to, portray what sells newspapers, and that's something bad. And so in the bad neighborhoods, these are the things that are going on. And so we're working with Senator Lesniak, who has written several bills in this area, and who has one now that's going to actually put lots of limits on solitary confinement, as well as an oversight board, so that it can be more controlled as to who's going in, and someone to oversee and watch. Is this person only in for 15 days, and make sure that the person is well, is in well health and is out within 15 days. And so right now there's no oversight, there's no control. And so those are the individuals we're working with. NARCAT, who is against solitary confinement cells, period. So those are the individuals we're working with, and there are several laws that have been made and several accomplishments that have been made as well. So we've been making some headwaves, and together with all of us doing this, we'll continue. I mean, we have, if you look at us in a whole, in the whole nation, that's the reason why all of the candidates that are running for president are now speaking about this issue. It's because we're bringing it up and we're bringing it to the forefront. And so those are the things we have to continue to do. Just become, help people become aware of what's happening and what's going on. So that's what we have to continue to do.
Miriam, did you want to add anything?
Sorry.
Did you want to add anything?
Not right now.
Okay. So I will ask you a question then, sort of based on this. So in cases involving Muslims in particular, as we know, there has been a lot of Islamophobia, and Islamophobia has served to justify state policies, right, against Muslims, and also build support from the ground up from members of society that signals to the state that it's okay if you treat these Muslims this way, right? So it's sort of a cyclical process. In the case of Ahmed, do you think that this particular type of racism and bigotry has affected him as it pertains to him being in solitary confinement, or any challenges that have been brought, or any of the conditions that he's been in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not just in Ahmed's case, but in general, when it comes to any convicted terrorist, the assumption is that, he's a bad guy. He must have, done something to harm the U.S. When in fact the majority are just fabricated allegations or entrapment cases where the FBI actually, puts together a plot and then targets young, susceptible, sometimes mentally ill Muslim youth. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but generally, when it comes to the American public, I get one of two responses. Either people are completely shocked that, some something like this could happen within the U.S. In the U.S. justice system. They're shocked that Ahmed was actually convicted when the only evidence was a torture obtained confession. So it's either shock or the other camp is the ends justify the means. So we must do whatever we can to protect our security, and national security comes first. So I get the sense that torture is not really that big of a deal to some people if it's being used on the other. So brown or black men, people who come from who are part of a different ethnicity or religion, so long as they can see them as the other, then it's justified.
Mhm. So, Amajil and Patrick, you both brought up the issue of disproportionate use of solitary confinement for those who are not white, so minority populations, right? Um, since we also know that mass incarceration is also an instance or an issue in which minorities are also disproportionately represented, what do you see as sort of the goal of solitary confinement and the use of that form of torture in the larger picture where minorities are imprisoned at a much higher rate than whites?
Okay, I guess I'll go. Were you going to go ahead, Patrick? Go ahead. Go ahead, Patrick.
Sure. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's funny. When it comes to African Americans, because I think that Islamics is a different category of racism and torture than African Americans. Because when it comes to African Americans, um, even back during the slavery time, there were additional things going on to cause torture, and it's the same process that's happening right now. I mean, even in the Constitution, um, slavery is still legal as long as you are imprisoned. And so it's the exact same concept, it's the exact same thing going along. The new Jim Crow says it best. It's a caste system that has been just rehacked over and over and over again. So when it comes to solitary confinement and torture, it's a way of dividing, it's a way of separating, it's a way of showing examples. It's a way of it's just like when our son went into to jail and went into solitary confinement, he was a part of the Crips, and so all right, we need to put the Crips inside solitary confinement and keep them away from the Bloods. So it's a way of separating so that you don't come together um, and actually form a large enough group to do something. So it's a way of separation. And that's the reason why we have so many political prisoners, because political prisoners can be very dangerous because they can actually rally the troops and they can really get inside the mind and tell the truth and give valuable information to a group of people who can actually do some good. And so that's one of the reasons why we see it as a high proportion of people who are political prisoners and people who have an influence on others inside solitary confinement. And that's the way we see it.
Hmm. And Amajil? So we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I had to put myself off of mute. I absolutely agree, with everything that Patrick said. Definitely, echo the influence aspect. Um, everything that Patrick mentioned historically regarding how African people have been treated within the United States. Um, and I also point out here in Maryland, when we were looking at the demographics of who goes into solitary confinement, it was interesting to find out that white prisoners were the ones that winded up in private custody when we looked at race across the board. So private custody is very different than disciplinary segregation or administrative segregation. So I'd actually like to know and see some research and information about the differences in disciplinary and administrative versus that private custody. Um, and the disparity that we've seen in the Maryland correctional system here, and how those in protective custody are treated than those that may be in disciplinary and administrative seg.
Okay. So, in terms of challenging the use of solitary confinement, can any of you speak to specific cases that have come out over the years? I know, Patrick, you mentioned the case in Rikers Island.
Mhm.
You talk about any specific cases that have actually been able to develop some momentum to challenge solitary confinement, perhaps some of the more high profile cases.
I'll speak. I would say that the prisoners in Pelican Bay were actually able to fight. And as Patrick mentioned, um, many of them were moved. A lot of them were moved out of solitary confinement. They were able to fight the systemic process which led them to solitary confinement. And now prisoners in California will have the opportunity to actually individually challenge their being put into solitary confinement. As I had mentioned before, there's challenges to youth being placed in solitary confinement, and I know the Center for Constitutional Rights actually has a case regarding control management units that several political prisoners are a part of that are literally challenging how the CMUs and other forms of solitary confinement are being used.
Great, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the CMUs also house a disproportionately Muslim population. The
Yes.
estimates are about two-thirds. And so that really ties into the specific piece around Islamophobia and mass incarceration, solitary confinement, because it's only because of Islamophobia that that could actually exist, and especially the secrecy surrounding um, the CMUs and what's going on with them. Patrick, did you want to add anything about specific cases? Did you have anything to add?
No, actually, I don't have anything to add. She did a pretty good job at it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So one of the things I want to be sure to address is, ways in which, or I guess the strategies that you have used to challenge solitary confinement. So I know that Patrick, you have the mock solitary confinement cell, and I know that Amajil, you're advocating heavily through your work as a social worker, and Miriam, obviously advocating on the case of her brother. What strategies have you all found that has been effective in challenging this particular type of torture?
Well, one of the biggest challenges we've had is lack of information, lack of communication, and the trickiness that goes on. You get close to making some really big changes and headways, and I give you a prime example.
Hmm.
The other cell that is a 5 by 7, smaller than the cell that we have, at one point that used to be a single solitary confinement cell. And what happened was, when it got really close to making some huge changes and identifying the issues and the problems, they added a second inmate to that particular cell, and then it is now considered not a solitary confinement cell.
Yeah.
So those are the challenges that we have when you don't have any information and you can't get any reports about things. Then it becomes very, very challenging to actually continue on and do some work. Or the name has changed for solitary confinement many different times, and so you get to a point and they says, oh, we don't have solitary confinement cells, oh, we have correctionist or correct. So the name changes. So these games are being played all the time, and that's our biggest challenge.
So what was your response or pushback in terms of, we didn't actually want as an alternative to have a cell with two inmates, and hoping really that they understood, perhaps they indeed understood what you were advocating for when you were, challenging solitary confinement. So what sort of, how did you respond to that?
I think we lost him. Oh, oh, there we go.
Oh, there I am. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, for some reason I couldn't get that button. But there's a different organization that works on all the logistics of the legislation and what they're doing and how they're doing it. What they do is they just have to rewrite the bill again and send it through again. And this is just a continuation that happens all the time. And of course, you guys know that in the state of New Jersey anyway, if it's not passed in 2 years, you have to start all over again. So, we're in a constant battle of continuing to start all over again, and now you have to go in for something different. Like, okay, now that there's two inmates in a cell that's 5 by 7, now there are different issues. The murder rate skyrocketed, of course. Just a whole bunch of issues that come into play with that. And so it's just a never-ending roller coaster battle back and forth with it. So that's what happens. We just have to rewrite it and send it back in again and go through the process.
And do you assume in this particular case that it's anything other than not actually wanting to change it? Do you believe that there's any amount of misunderstanding, or is it just the fact that they have no intention of changing the use of solitary confinement?
I would say that is absolutely the case. They have no inkling of a use of trying to change solitary confinement. It's working for them for what they're trying to accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And behind the scenes, the United States have always been a part of some torture and things that we don't say out front. So this is no different. If you look at countries around us, United States have started wars. I mean, so it's no different. So it's just you keep the fight until enough people are aware that it causes a social movement. It's the same thing that happened with the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
We had to continue to keep the awareness until it created the civil rights movement, and this is no different. It's just a social movement that we need this time.
So, Amajil, based on what Patrick just talked about, I'm curious to know if you think there's any way when you're advocating for the use for the end for ending solitary confinement, is there a way you can really sort of anticipate the ways in which your efforts might be stumbled or fuddled or whatever it is? So rather than ending up with a cell that has two prisoners in it, is there really a way that you can kind of anticipate the lengths to which the state will go to preserve solitary confinement?
I think it's pretty difficult. Patrick mentioned earlier the semantics with changing the names, whether it's a CMU or segregation or whatever term is being used to mask the torture that is taking place with prisoners. One thing that we did find here in Maryland is that specifically. Um, those from the Department of Corrections. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Those within the Department of Corrections, they wanted to, I guess, mask some of the things that are happening and or taking place with prisoners. I was actually very upset during this last legislative session that the bill that we had simply was just a bill that would require transparency, between the government and, citizens of the state of Maryland to get just that basic information, which we actually do have from the Vera Institute actually coming in, and giving us that information. And the Vera Institute specifically stated, not only gave us data, but also gave ways that Maryland could change its solitary confinement and its uses of solitary confinement regarding giving out that disciplinary segregation for an inmate using foul language or, not wanting to move or do the job that they were told to do. So I guess right now we're in the process of trying to revive this transparency bill that had a lot to do with, even the length of time and so many different pieces of information that were asking for, that we wanted it on an individual level, that they made it seem like they didn't have, but we know based on state policy and uses of solitary confinement, they have to keep all this data, they have to keep all this information. They just don't want to make it transparent to us. They have to, keep records of when somebody took a shower or how long they, were out of their cell. All of that information we know they obtain. They just refuse to share it with us. So at this point, we are looking at alternatives to solitary confinement, specifically for prisoners that have low-level offenses associated to the correctional officers. We're also looking at practices in the United States as well as other practices around the world, and offering those alternatives to the politicians as well as educating them about solitary confinement. But we were just really upset this past session that we couldn't even get, the bill was just simply asking for transparency. It wasn't, asking for an end to solitary confinement. It wasn't asking for anything other than give us the information. So I think that that's a really big battle right along, of course, with the issue of semantics, is just, getting that information that the system refuses to give.
And then, Mariam, did you have anything to add in terms of any challenges your family or your attorney has made to Ahmed's being held in solitary confinement, and anything that has or hasn't worked?
Well, at this point, actually, our priority has been to get the SAMs, the special administrative measures, removed, because they really limit the circle of people he can communicate with and how often. So we're only allowed 2 phone calls a month, and it can only be with immediate family. So that's been a priority, but I mean, I know that there have been some people who have been moved out of um, the 80 max and moved to a medium security prison. So potentially that's something we can hope to pursue. Um, but our priority again is to get the SAMs removed.
So, what would you all tell people who are interested in getting more involved with addressing the issue of solitary confinement? What are some tangible ways they can get involved? What are some particular areas within this issue and the campaigns around it that really need more manpower and support?
For us, we recommend that that people read more and become more educated about what the issues are and what's happening, even in your neck of the wood or your state and overall. That's the first thing. The second thing is get involved in organizations that are actually doing something in this area, whether it's informing individuals, or there are some organizations that that write their senators and their congressmen all the time, write the president. So we need to create more awareness and more people talking about it. And so those are the things that we ask people to do. Um, we ask individuals to um, use some of the documentary footages that are already in place, and just get your, whether it's your church or congregation, whatever, your group or organization, get them together, watch a documentary and have a conversation about it so that the word spreads even more. So you don't have to be this huge activist to do something. So those are the things that we recommend for individuals that we work with and that we come in contact with.
Jill, did you have something to add?
I would definitely, I guess, respond back to what Patrick was saying about, um, using, um, faith-based organizations as a vehicle. We've noticed here in the state of Maryland that there's an overlap between advocates who have been fighting to end the death penalty, who are now very much involved in ending or fighting to end solitary confinement in the state of Maryland. So I think it's important, for us to like overlap and connect those two struggles together, because essentially, solitary confinement or prisoners who have no opportunity for parole or life without parole, and prisoners who are on death row, they all experience a lot of the same mental health issues, and many of our prisoners, are essentially, unfortunately, they're just, waiting to die. They're not on death row, but that's they've been given life without the possibility of parole. So I think it's really important, as Patrick had mentioned earlier, the new Jim Crow and issues of mass incarceration. We have to begin to link all of these different struggles together. And solitary confinement is not one of those issues that has become prominent, in the struggle around the issues of mass incarceration, but it needs to be.
Hmm. Absolutely. Mariam, did you want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do in terms of writing to prisoners?
Could you repeat that in terms of?
Of writing to prisoners.
Okay. So yeah, definitely. A lot of prisoners don't have communication with the outside world. They don't have any family writing to them, or they just like to. It'd be really beneficial to them to have more contact with other people. So we're putting together a toolkit for people who'd like to write to prisoners. And obviously, um, the more social interaction, the better. and it'd be really beneficial to them. So we put together a list of prisoners at AD max right now who can receive letters, and we'd like people to write to them. And Mahad, did you want to add on how are you going to send an email or?
So we will follow up on Facebook. We'll post a message saying if you want to get in touch with us and write to a prisoner, just message us and we will give you names and instructions as to how to write a letter, what are some things you should include, can't include, and then where to send the letter. And that way, we can try to take some sort of tangible, concrete action. Because for whatever it's worth, we want to make sure that the prisoners who are in solitary confinement can get some kind of human contact, and to know that there's people on the outside that are really trying to advocate for them and challenge the conditions under which they're being held.
Right. And I mean, it's actually, I said that we have a list of prisoners at AD max, but our pen pal program is not limited to just that prison. It's any prisoner that writes to us requesting a pen pal, we have in our system. So there is a list of prisoners who requested pen pals or people to write to them. I also wanted to mention that the first ever congressional hearing on solitary confinement happened in 2012, and I had attended that. So I think it is useful to write to senators and congressmen about solitary confinement. And that was pretty historic, and it got a lot of attention at the time. I don't think there was a follow-up, but I think it's important that we have that platform and that people, show up and testify.
Absolutely. So I want to be conscious of everyone's time, and in doing so, I'd like to ask if you guys want to make a closing statement, 2 to 3 minutes, anything you want to add, anything you want to tell the viewers and or the audience that watches the video thereafter, including resources, and maybe a little bit more about your organization.
I'll go first because I actually have another meeting to go to. But the campaign in the New Jim Crow is we have a website that's exactly what it says. The campaign in New Jim Crow. Also, you can find us on Facebook. Facebook is probably the easiest way to do it. Campaign in the New Jim Crow, Trenton, Princeton. And all the information is on there for giving support or becoming a part of the chapter as well. And we do have individuals who are part of the chapter who live in other places, and they help however they can. So those are the things that I would say, but the biggest thing is to get out there and start reading more and understanding exactly what's happening, and then attempt to spread the word so that the more people that know, because you're not going to see this on televisions and things like that, so we are the media. We are the ones to get the word out. So that's what you have to do. So that's my spiel.
Great.
And I appreciate you guys doing this and having this, because this is a part of what we need. This is what what helps. So I really appreciate you guys and what you're doing, and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you for being on here.
Okay.
We're going to end in like a couple more minutes, so just stay with us for a second.
Okay.
And Amajil, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Patrick. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody on the panel, and for Maha for organizing this effort this evening. I am a part of a lot of different organizations that work around solitary issues of mass incarceration, solitary confinement, The most well-known organization that I work with is called the Jericho Movement. And listeners could go to thejerichomovement.com and see our list of prisoners. We work in solidarity with other organizations across the country that address issues of political prisoners. Many of the political prisoners on our list have had rotations in that ADX that Miriam has been talking about this evening. One of the prisoners that I actually write to that's in ADX is Larry Hoover, well-known street organizer out of Chicago. Um, Also, I just wanted to let everybody know that every Sunday night at 9 o'clock, I have a blog talk radio show called Political Prisoner Radio, where I cover, um, cases of political prisoners, political dissent, and all of these issues regarding mass incarceration, racism, Islamophobia, animal rights activism. Um, we cover as many cases, as possible, and it's all about, educating, the community about, our families, our friends, and what's happening, even in the streets right now as we speak around activists and organizers fighting against police terrorism and genocide. So, thank you.
Thank you, Amatil. And Mariam?
Yeah, I'm not on mute. Just wanted to thank you all for the work that you do, and thanks to our viewers for attending. Um, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or contact me through Facebook. I don't, I mean, I take every opportunity to talk about my brother's case, but obviously this is not something that just affects my brother. Affects, like thousands, hundreds of thousands of families across the U.S. I mean, we have, millions of people in the prison system, and there's so many problems that I don't even know where to start with, but we can start somewhere, and it's really great having a platform such as this one where we can discuss different issues that we can work on collectively.
So thank you all so much again for joining the panel today and really providing a lot of insight and information. I would welcome you to post any links for more resources or links to your organizations on the event page, so anyone who's interested can check them out. I also wanted to say that this particular panel is the first of our National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms online series called Just Us and Injustice. So please stay tuned for our next panel, which will happen in December. And once again, I want to thank all the panelists for being with us today. And if you have any questions, please refer to the event page, and we can try to get questions out to the speakers. So thank you all, and have a great night.